Well, let's follow up on some of these questions about the death of a Canadian soldier in Iraq and what it might mean for the Canadian mission there. From the foyer of the House of Commons this evening, we're joined by James Bezan, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence. Jack Harris is the defence critic for the official opposition NDP, and Joyce Murray is the defence critic for the Liberal Party. Good to see you all.
Hi, Peter.
Mr. Bezan, let me start with you if I can. Let's begin with the contradictory versions here of over how the Canadians ended up being fired upon by the Peshmerga forces. The Kurds are blaming the Canadian soldiers for what happened. Has the government been able to find out what actually did happen and who's at fault here?
Well, first of all, Peter, I want to express my condolences and, of course, condolences of all parliamentarians to Sergeant Doran's family, friends and comrades. This was a tragedy, a mistaken identity, and it was unfortunately a friendly fire incident that the individuals that they were there to train in the dark fired upon them as they came up to a special operations, special observatory where they were earlier in the day watching over the operations of the Kurdish Peshmerga. And you know, it's been reported, and I'll expand on it, that they'd already cleared through 2 checkpoints, only a couple hundred meters back of where they were approaching. They had all the signals had already been pre-approved with commanders of the Kurdish Peshmerga at that operation, and they were coming up to that location where they actually used the proper signals, the protocols were filed, the rules of engagement were appropriate, and unfortunately were fired upon. And they're about 200 meters behind the forward line of operation of the Kurdish Peshmerga, but they were still about 2 kilometers away from where the ISIL terrorists and jihadists were located. Okay, so
just very quickly here, so the government's position here is, because we've heard from some Kurdish officials so far, and we understand that they may revise that explanation, but so far their explanation is that the Canadians arrived, jumped out, surprised the Kurd forces there, who I guess they claim weren't expecting them, spoke in Arabic, and then that caused the forces, one soldier and then others, to open fire. That you're categorically saying that's not what happened.
Look, I find it personally very hard to believe that our Special Operations Forces, which are some of the highest trained and most professional soldiers, not only in Canada but in the world, who are there to train and assist a militia of volunteers, and as they were approaching the observation post is where they came under fire from some of the people that they were there to train. So it was a very tragic event, and I can tell you that I think that the Kurdish Peshmerga, in my opinion, should wait until all the investigations are done. We have the coalition through their special task force doing an investigation. We have the Department of National Defence through the Provost Marshal doing an investigation, and Special Operations Forces under the direction of General Rouleau is also doing an investigation. So I think that let's get all the facts on the table before people start speculating.
Right. Let's move to your colleague, Mr. Harris here. Jack Harris, what questions or concerns does the NDP have in the wake of this incident?
Well, first of all, I'm prepared to talk about the issues, but not before expressing my condolences to Sergeant Doran and his family. Our heart goes out to him. He made the supreme sacrifice, and his comrades and colleagues in the forces. We could have easily had 4 deaths today. It's a tragedy that should not have happened. We were told this couldn't happen because we weren't involved in the frontline operations, but here, of course, we are. And one of the concerns I want to express, too, is the refusal of the new defence minister to treat this death as a combat death. When a Canadian soldier in an operation is fired upon and killed by someone who thinks they're the enemy, and to suggest that that's not in a combat zone, whether it's 2 meters or 200 meters from a so-called front line, which we're told doesn't exist.
Are you suggesting here that had they been training these forces away from the front line, this likely would not have happened?
Absolutely. We're talking about in the I don't know whether it was the dead of night, but certainly at night, traveling obviously without proper identification as to who they were, and maybe they were traveling alone. What is it that they're doing that if nobody knows, that they don't know they're there, they don't know who they are, and they're prepared to fire on them? That's a pretty serious situation, and it certainly qualifies in my books as a combat death, and I would say every soldier would think that as well. And as far as an investigation investigation goes, there doesn't seem to be a need for an investigation in Mr. Bezan's version. He has all the answers. He has the conclusions. It's their fault. So these investigations don't seem to have a lot of credibility.
All right, Joyce Murray, what questions or concerns does the Liberal Party have in the wake of this incident?
Well, firstly, I would like to say that the Liberal Party also wants to express our compassion and condolences to Sergeant Dwaron's family, and also we're mindful of how this kind of unfortunate incident with 4 people affected affects the whole Armed Forces family. And especially the families of the wounded and Sergeant Dwaron. So it's not a time for finger pointing. I think it is a time to gather information as to what may have happened there so that processes can be improved and these complex missions to work with other forces. But until that information is in, I don't see the benefit of finger pointing.
Okay.
And I will say that we are expecting that the investigation's parameters will be public and that there will be an open sharing of the results of the investigation. And we are going to hold the government to account on that.
Okay. Mr. Bezan, Canadians have traded fire with ISIS. Now we have a Canadian soldier shot and killed, 3 others wounded at or very close to the front lines of the battle. How does the government continue to make the case that it's not a combat mission?
Because we're there advising and assisting or training. We do control and command. So they're not engaging with the enemy. And in this situation, yeah, mistaken identity, but essentially it's an unfortunate event where one of the soldiers, one of the Peshmerga that you're training, actually fired upon them as they came up. And it was 11 o'clock at night is what's been reported. And they had been up at that same observation post at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So
what about the suggestion that if they weren't at or near the front lines, the likelihood of this friendly fire incident happening as part of a training mission is less likely?
Well, and that's just all speculation and hypothetical, and I don't want to go down that path. I think that, as I've said, is that they were in and near the theater, but it was still 2 kilometers away from where ISIL was stationed with their jihadists. But let's remember why they're there, and something that Sergeant Dwaron believed in, which was that he wanted to fight terrorism. He was a counterterrorism expert, something that he longed to do, even and aspired to do, even as a high school kid. He put it in his yearbook, and he was doing what he believed in, and that was making sure that this ISIL threat didn't spread within Iraq and continue to attack ethnic and religious minorities or come here to Canada.
Mr. Harris, if we talk about what's next then, Parliament at some point, I expect, will be asked to consider an extension to this mission. The government seems to be signaling that's where it's headed. I guess what is your view of what you think might be on the table? More likely that we'd be pushing towards the possibility of combat, and I guess we're into the descriptor again, if it becomes a mission about not just holding ground and stopping the advance of ISIL, but trying to take ground back.
Well, there's a lot of meat in what you said there, Peter. But first of all, it's very worrisome the way the government has been talking. We've had the Foreign Affairs Minister in Iraq in the last week musing about staying our ground and musing about the comparisons to Afghanistan, and we've had General Lawson explaining how we got to where we are now. I'm assuming from the definite point of the Prime Minister on September 30th. No, we were advising assist. We will not be accompanying to the front line. This is advise and assist only. Now we know that that's not the case, and the only cover for that is Mr. General Lawson saying the mission has evolved.
Will the NDP oppose an extension of the mission?
Well, we haven't seen an extension of the mission yet, but we have very grave concerns about what evolution means and where that's going to lead us. And are we going to be looking at an evolution that could end us in another 10 or 12 years without any end game, without any way of getting out of here? That's what bothers us.
Okay.
We want this government to come clean. They haven't come clean yet.
Joyce Murray, what do Liberals want to know before deciding whether to support an extension of this mission?
We want to see the facts of the incident, the tragedy that just occurred, and we want to see what is being proposed by the Conservative government. And I think, lastly, we want assurances that that the government will be forthright with Canadians about whatever they are proposing, because, as you know, there was a lot of controversy about the nature of the mission for the Special Operations Forces. There was a change and not a clear acknowledgement by this government that they had made that change. So we want them to be forthright, but the Liberals, as before, feel that it's important that Canada be part of the global effort to stop ISIS.
All right. Well, thank you all. We'll continue to follow this story and appreciate you taking the time to speak with me this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.